After Callista got her little introduction to the events of the Ruination, where she really just killed a man who betrayed his crew, while the Ruination was forming in the sky above her, on the other side of Valoran, nearing the coasts of Demacia, we got a story about Hecarim. So now, finally, without further ado, let's have a look at how the Black Mist conquers the Demacian kingdom. Here's the story, the Despoiler of Havenfall. Before we begin, even though Havenfall is not marked on the official map of Runeterra, we know where it is because it was shown in the Garen novel. Havenfall are the coasts directly next to the great city of Demacia. The story begins with Jonath, a Demacian country boy who was pushing through the Black Mist, avoiding shapes that were reaching for him from beyond. He fumbled with the horse's reins in his hands, trying to find the nerve to do what he had to do. To mount up and ride for safety. He was stopped by a knight, a woman who tried to remind him that they all had a duty. Jonath blinked the fear from his eyes and looked at her. She was mounted on her horse, but unable to even ride herself in the saddle. Her armor was pierced and slick with blood, but Jonath couldn't even imagine what kind of weapon could inflict such wounds. Regardless, the knight was dying. In her eyes he saw judgment. They thought he was weak, unworthy. She grabbed the reins he held and pulled him closer. She explained that he had to carry word to the capital. The heir had to know. He had to tell Prince Jarvan what was happening, that the garrison couldn't hold them off. Faint sound of battle from the south told Jonath that the mist had already reached Havenfall. The air around him grew colder, darker. The inky mist inched closer. Jonath didn't care about the Knights of Havenfall. The supposed elite of the crown had never done anything for him. He then angrily yanked the reins from the knight, trying to ignore her pained gasp as she rolled out of her saddle and hit the ground. "Protector, forgive me," he whispered, his voice wavering. This was no worse than the other times he had taken horses. He tried to tell himself as he mounted. Sitting on the horse, Jonath felt at least a bit calmer. At the crossroads, he looked around to take in the situation. To the east was the road to the great city, with its high walls and countless soldiers. Jonath didn't think they would need a warning. Surely the monsters of the Black Mist would be no match for the capital's defense of stone and steel. To the south was Havenfall, his home. He could just about see it from where he stood now. And behind the town, there was an endless open country full of fields. Jonath spent days there, riding across the rolling hills, racing incoming ships along the cliffs, rejoicing in the thrills of unchecked freedom. He had never kept any of the horses he took. He was no thief who deserved to be exiled to the hinterlands. He borrowed horses, always returning them at the end of his adventures, tired but unharmed. For a moment, Jonath thought about how he could return this one, but then he stopped himself. It wasn't his fault he got in the way of the mist which resulted in the knight dying. Even though he took a horse, that didn't make him guilty. That's who Jonath really was. A boy with great talent when it came to handling horses, but one that could never be relied on. Even his elders, the horse breeders and the traders, knew that Jonath would never put the demands of others ahead of his own needs. No use in talent if he couldn't be relied on, they said. No use in the approval of people who didn't value true freedom, Jonath thought back. Not to mention the garrison, which glorified obedience above all else, sneering at him even when he came to prove his mettle on the recruiting fields. Well, out in the hills, chasing the wind on the back of an unbroken steed, he was the exemplar. He would outrun this unnatural mist and lose himself among the ranging herds. Urging his stallion forward, Jonath rode south towards his home. He could feel the stallion's fear. Whatever had scared it was beyond just an ordinary battle. It was something that didn't belong here. And Jonath felt it too. Primal fear seized him, squeezing his chest with an unyielding grip. The mist pulled close, then pulsed clear from the crossing, as if limbs within were pulling the veil aside. And around him, Jonath heard nothing. Eventually the silence was broken by the sound of steeled hoofs. As the veil parted, Jonath could see riders in the gloom. Even though he could hear the mounts at full gallop and the clatter of plate armor, somehow the formation of horses was immobile. as if it was a painting of the crown's elite on the charge. But these were not Demacian knights. These riders were not here to protect. They were covered in black iron plate, and an evil light glowed in their motionless eyes. There was a bannerman carrying a steel pennant, even though the fabric made an audible beating noise. A moment later, a hornblower with a lipless mouth deadlocked around his instrument sounded the attack. The mist shrieked. Hecarim! Somehow Jonath knew it was a name of death itself. That's when he noticed the rider in the lead. He was gigantic, towering over the other riders, shaking the ground with each unmoving stride. His eyes, bright with inner fire, took all before them. Even staring ahead, they seemed to bore into Jonath, searing through him, filling him with an ancient dread. The rider turned his head and smiled. Jonath let out a cry, recoiling with fear. He startled his stallion and was thrown on the ground. In panic, the animal bolted into the darkness, leaving Jonath stunned by panic in the dust. He wished he could pray away what he would see when he looked up.
Rise, squire. Find your courage. Look at me.
The words were guttural, each syllable slowly surfacing as if rising from the depths of a surface. Jonath could not place the accent, but he had heard its mocking tone before. A sting of old spite made him raise his head. The hoofs burned the soil where they stood. The rider's horse seemed to be made entirely of blackened iron, glowing from within with green fire. Jonath's breath caught in his throat, as he saw the rider was not saddled on this unnatural steed. He was fused with it. What was he? Had he come as punishment for Jonath's crime? The monstrosity laughed, slowly raising an infernal glaive. Tears ran down Jonath's face, his mind seizing hold of the only thought it could. Protector, forgive me. Protector, forgive me. But the blow never fell. Instead, the monster called one of his ghastly riders closer. The rider too was not a horseman at all, but he was fused with the body of a horse. The entire formation of riders was deformed just like their leader. Hecarim gripped the rider's neck and slowly, effortlessly, ripped his torso from the rest of the body. The rider, trailing green smoke, made no sound, twitching erratically. Where his body had been, there was now the head of a withered armored warhorse.
We'll be back for you later.
The leader chuckled as he released the rider's spirit. The spirit floated midair, aimlessly now that it had been severed from its animal half. The rest of the undying formation remained utterly motionless, frozen in time. Hecarim turned his gaze to Jonath.
I claim this land by decree of King Viego, regent of the Shadow Isles. Let my loyal knights witness that Hecarim, conqueror of Hylia, grandmaster of the Iron Order, honors his foes with a fair fight.
The words twisted around his smirk.
So find your courage, noble squire, and mount up. War has come.
He presented the reins of the spectral warhorse to Jonath. Jonath stared at Hecarim, the tone of his voice giving it all away as a lie. He looked around him, the formation of knights looming, frozen grins carved into their skeletal faces. His mind screamed in tune with the whispers beyond the veil. Let soldiers deal with these monsters. He grabbed the reins and, with one motion, swung up into the saddle. The steed's body was solid yet incorporeal at the same time. Where he would sense a horse's character, Jonath felt only emptiness. Where he should feel a union of kindred minds, he teetered at the edge of a ravenous void. Jonath let his fear take over, and hammered his heels into its flanks. He ripped at the reins and turned south, piercing into the wall of black mist. Hooked nails scoring my skin, long dead grimaces accusing me, and bursting out the other side into the clear. Ahead, the path was open. The sun was setting over the bay, the sea glittering calmly beyond the cliffs. Behind Jonath, hollow furnace laughter echoed through the crossroads.
Give chase,
he heard Hecarim order. Jonath clanked to the steed, speeding down the path faster than he had ever seen any stallion gallop. Behind him, the mist lined the path. He looked up and saw the constellation of the Protector's shield in the darkening sky. But his brief smile at the stars turned stale, as he heard the long call of the hunting horn behind him. His heart quickened as he saw the mist closing in, with Hecarim and his Iron Order riding within it. The darkness then flanked Jonath, revealing shapes inside it. His mouth fell open in horror, his vision blurring from sudden tears. But he could see her nonetheless. The knight he had left to die, now a ghostly form trapped in the mist. She raised an arm that ended with a ragged stump, the hand that had held the reins missing. "You have no honor," she wailed. "You are no true Demacian." "Please, no," Jonath whispered, forcing his gaze ahead. He frantically kicked the steed's flanks, willing it to get him away from this horror. He glanced down at the reins. The knight's severed fist was gripping them, yanking the mount into a stall. "Flee, coward!" the voice echoed in the mist. Whimpering in anguish, Jonath ripped the reins out of the fist and threw the plated gauntlet toward the riders at his heels.
"So quick to take offense, squire,"
Hecarim jeered.
"I did not think you had the courage. If you are challenging me to a duel, then I accept. We noblemen have a code to follow after all."
Jonath raised his arm in front of his face as Hecarim close to striking distance, but instead of being beheaded by the glaive, Jonath was engulfed once more in the darkness. The faces of the dead surrounded him. Jonath spurred his spectral steed, and as he burst from the mist, Hecarim and the riders disappeared from view. By the time Jonath passed the stables at the edge of Havenfall, night fell over the lands. The sound of battle had stopped, and the town appeared largely untouched. He felt a brief wave of relief. He would find soldiers who could fight. Commander Tyndarid and his garrison would see off the riders on Jonath's trail. For all his arrogance, the commander was an indomitable warrior. Jonath saw war horses, some half-saddled and barded, some still tied to their hitching rails, laid dead. His heart sank. As Jonath's steed carried him further into the settlement, the true horror of the black mist around him became apparent. Jonath slowly turned around. All of this couldn't be real. It had to be a piece of his troubled imagination, or some dark sorcery worked by a vengeful mage. Yet, his eyes told him it was all real. In the streets, the spirits of newly dead townfolk lingered above their own corpses, cowering in fear, wailing silently, reliving the instant they were cut down by the Iron Order. Proud knights of the crown stood mute where they had died battling. As Jonath passed, one by one, spirits fixated their hollow eyes on him. A knight, his killer spear still pinning his shield to the shade of his body, made a step toward Jonath. A gasp escaped his lips as he recognized Commander Tyndarid. A group of dead shipbuilders rose to their feet and tumbled toward Jonath in agitation. He kicked his steed and made his escape. A voice inside him whispered that even in death, they knew he didn't belong. The merchant quarters were being devastated by wraith-like riders. Green fire engulfed the buildings and cast a deathly light across the square, the wood somehow remaining untouched by the flames. The townsfolk inside screamed, and Jonath looked away as he rode, trying not to hear them. By the harbor, the fishing boats were on fire as well. Jonath looked out over the bay, his attention caught by another mournful note of the hunting horn. A squadron of spectral riders raced across the calm water in the moonlight, lowering their spears as they neared the last sail ship still afloat. Moments later, the sailors cried out, and the ship disappeared in the mist. The entirety of Havenfall was under siege. Who knew how much of Demacia was affected by this invasion? Circling his mount, Jonath tried to control his fear and find a way out. He was considering getting back his own steed and riding the waters across the bay. He couldn't outrun the monsters, but he could slip away unnoticed. Jonath was brought back to the present by the sound of footsteps. It was 4 survivors, 2 siblings armed with blades, an elderly woman dressed like an illuminator holding a steel mace, and the blacksmith called Adamar. He held a heavy blade and a shield. The group was sneaking its way through the market square. Adamar quietly called out for Jonath. The smith was glad to see that someone else also survived. They were getting out of there, and he was just about to invite Jonath to join them. But then he noticed the steed. Adamar quickly ushered everyone to hide behind him, as he accused Jonath of siding with the monsters. The Illuminator tried to calm him down. seeing that Jonath was simply as afraid as all of them were. She then told Jonath to abandon that abomination and come with them. Full of guilt, Jonath replied he wished he could. But Adamar was right. He didn't belong here. He didn't deserve their mercy. They all knew what he had done this day. He was no Demacian. The Illuminator assured him that he was no stranger. He was Jonath of Ropemarker's Row. She knew he was praying at the Protector's shrine. She knew his heart wanted to lead him back to righteousness. She didn't know if it would, but that night, it was all about survival. So she urged him to get off that thing and come with them. Jonath thanked the Protector for her mercy, and he swung his leg up to dismount. But before he was able to get off, a blink of an eye later, the mist ripped open above the town square, and the riders burst forth, with Hecarim in the lead, charging through thin air. Before Jonath understood what he was looking at, Hecarim's glaive struck the Illuminator in the chest, cleaving her in two. The other riders ran through Adamar and the two boys. The riders then went completely still, just like the first time Jonath had seen them. Hecarim paced back and forth, his eyes burning with ancient intellect. He was the Grand Master Conqueror, Despoiler of Havenfall. How was Jonath meant to stand against this infernal War Master? How was anyone? Hecarim closed the distance, riding up alongside Jonath until they stood shoulder by shoulder. The Grand Master was taller than Jonath by a half, and so easily. Slowly he reached down toward the bridle of Jonath's borrowed steed, arresting it in place.
You acquainted yourself well today.
Hecarim said, the deep furnace roar softened to a growl, his gaze settling on the moonlit bay behind Jonath.
I have seen kings lose their minds when faced with the black mist, and the eternal anguish that it brings. Everyone you ever knew perished this night, yet your will to survive remains unbroken. Who else are you willing to sacrifice so you can live? Are you willing to let even your lineage die?
Jonath's heart pounded, his vision blurred as tears of helpless panic threatened to overwhelm him. Moments ago, Hecarim had slain the last survivors of his hometown, and now he had a conversation with him, as if they had sparred in some practice duel on the training grounds. The king is already dead. The crown prince, Protector guide his hand, is next in line, and there could be no one more deserving. I do not want to put him in peril for my own gain. Hecarim remained still for a moment, then scoffed with soured mirth.
In the line of succession, the crown does not always go to the most fitting heir. And what do I care for the frail kingdoms of the living? We all have to make do with the hand fate deals us.
Up close, Jonath could see the countless pits and scratches in Hecarim's armor. He could see endless years of conflict scored into the black iron plates, encasing the flames that made up his body, and understood a fundamental truth about this creature. He had been created by war, and he was made for war. He had done nothing but battle for centuries, condemned to relive his worst transgressions. Whatever crimes he had committed in life, this was his punishment, and he relished every second of it. Wherever the unnatural mist went, Hecarim and his Iron Order followed, pillaging, killing, and reveling in the atrocities they inflicted on the living. What would become of Demacia if no one stopped this evil? Jonath finally understood something that had eluded him his entire life. Courage wasn't some unique quality infused into true Demacians at birth, or a measure of his own worth to the world. It was a question of realizing what must be done, and choosing to do it no matter what. He felt calm for the first time since the crossroads. He remembered the wounded knight's dying words one last time. There are no soldiers left in Havenfall to warn the crown prince, and soon there might be none left in the entire kingdom. Fixing the Grandmaster with his gaze, he pulled the reins from Hecarim's armored fist, taking control of the warhorse. Hecarim indulged him, his posture changing from introspection to curiosity. Jonath wheeled, gaining a few paces of distance. I have seen how you ride down defenseless villagers, reveling in their screams of helplessness. I know you are bound to your basest instincts for eternity, but there is more to you. If a shred of your living self remains, if you have any honor at all, abomination, you will let me pass. He collected himself. He knew he would not make it to the great city, but he was going to try. The bulk of his starless mount tensed, as it sensed what was about to happen. With all his might, Jonath gave it the spurs, and his spectral steed charged. For the first time in his life, Jonath truly believed the words as they sprang from his lips. For the uncrowned king! For Demacia! Hecarim smirked in delight as the boy charged willingly toward the spears of the Iron Order. The folly of youth had stayed with him until death, a flaw too common in Hecarim's experience. But as long as Viego chased his own foolish obsession across the oceans of the world, trailing the mist in his wake, Hecarim would enjoy the spoils of war. Around him, as far as he could see, the rider spread terror and death. A cast iron grin widened across his burning skull.
If but our hands were not bound by frailty,
he mused as he watched the last living soul of Havenfall perish. And that was Hecarim's part in the upcoming Siege of Demacia. Here we learned a couple of things. I noticed that the story mentioned that the flames did not touch the wood, which was used to construct the buildings. I wonder if that's because the wood comes from the Petricite forest, and Petricite actually affects the Black Mist. Also, we learned that Hecarim is just glad that Viego is spreading the mist around, because Hecarim is free to use it to travel around and slaughter the living for fun. We also learned that Havenfall was conquered, so the Black Mist is now approaching the walls of the great city itself. I know that the Protector, or Gale as many of us know, is a godly being Demacians worship in the darkest of times. But since the kingdom of Demacia is nearing its ruin, I think two things might happen. It wouldn't be unthinkable for Morgana to get out of her hiding to save the citizens of her ancient home. But also, Silas will have quite the view once he returns back from the Freljord.